There are a bunch of religions that are based off of the Bible. You got Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And many people try to use the authority that is in the Bible to push their own agendas of power. Specifically, the religious institutions use out-of-context laws that are found in the Bible in order to justify paying for the many expenses that their institutions require. One of these laws that is used excessively in religious life is the law of tithes. Tithes refers to the 10% charity that is required by a person to give. Now, 10% of what? And 10% to who? That's a question that every church or synagogue seems to say, well, 10% of all your earnings to us every year. And so every time that you go to the shul, every time that you go to the mosque, or whatever it may be, they'll be there at the door saying, time to give your tithes. So let's take a look at the Torah and see what are the actual laws of tithes so that we can know what we are required to do from God, independent of the vested interests of the institutions. Let's take a look at Genesis, because Genesis is the first time that the concept of tithes are even mentioned. But we will see that this is a very specific scenario. The story goes that Abraham had a nephew, Lot, who found himself in Sodom and Gomorrah. And Sodom and Gomorrah went to war, and Lot was captured. So then Abraham, being an old man, gathered all of his trained soldiers, those who lived in his household, and he went to war against many kings. And he actually won what would seem to be a miraculous battle. But he won, and he brought all of the spoils of war back to the king of Sodom. Now, really, because he had won the war, everything belonged to him. In fact, the king of Sodom even said, Abraham, take it all, and I'll just take the people, but you can take all of the money and the gold and everything. Now, Abraham said, I don't want any of it. I don't want you to say that I made Abraham rich. So Abraham got his fortune through the grace of God. But because that all of the spoils belonged to Abraham, Abraham was able to do what he wanted with them. And so as they returned from battle, it says here in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, and Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest to God Most High. Verse 19, and he blessed him, and he said, blessed is Abram to God Most High, owner of heaven and earth. Verse 20, and blessed is God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hands. And he gave him a tithe from all. So Abraham, having all of this spoils of war, tons and tons of gold and silver and everything, before he gave it back to the king of Sodom, he gave a tenth to Melchizedek, who is described here in the Torah as being a priest to God Most High. And so, first of all, it is not an obligation to give tithes to the priest. However, because Abraham perceived Melchizedek as being a priest of God Most High, which I'm not sure how many priests that could actually be said about, he then gave him a tithe from the spoils of war, all of this additional wealth that he happened to have. So let's just be very clear here. When a priest comes and says, I am a priest to God Most High, first of all, red flag. He is probably not a priest to God Most High. Additionally, You are not obligated to give him a tithe, especially if you don't have money. Abraham had lots of extra spoils here to give, and so he gave a tithe to Melchizedek because Melchizedek was truly a priest of God Most High. So we can already see that from a concept, they're now deriving an obligation, telling you that everyone is obligated to give a tenth to the priest when that priest is probably not a priest to God Most High. And that tenth may not even be something that you can afford, which means you should not be taking your hard-earned money that you need to support your family with and start giving it to the church or to the synagogue or to the temple, whatever it may be. We continue on to the book of Numbers, where the next instance of tithes is mentioned. Now again, you will see that this is a very specific scenario, and it actually does not apply today. Numbers chapter 18, verse 21. And to the children of Levi, behold, I have given all of the tithes in Israel as an inheritance in exchange for their service, which they serve in the temple of meeting. The Levites served in the temple. The Levites did not actually even have an inheritance in the land of Israel. And so God promises, as it says here in verse 24, for the tithes of the children of Israel, which they raise up as a contribution to Yahweh, I have given to the Levites as an inheritance. So it's very specifically the Levites who serve in the temple, who serve in Israel, who, when the children of Israel bring their contributions to raise up to God, God gifted 10% of those contributions to the Levites. For example, if an Israelite were to come with his first fruits offering, God gifted a tenth of that to the Levites. But again, we do not have a temple, we do not have offerings to God, and we do not have a tribe of Levites who are solely dedicated to carrying out the spiritual practices of the people who don't even have an inheritance among the people. So another tithe, but this tithe is simply not applicable nowadays. And now we turn to Deuteronomy. And this is where things actually get kind of comical, because when we are told by all of these religious institutions to give our money to them so that they can use it, let's actually see what the Torah says about tithes, because this is a situation of tithes where it actually belongs to you. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22. You shall surely tithe all of the grain of your planting that comes out of your field year by year, and you shall eat it before Yahweh your God in the place that he chooses to rest his name there, the tithes of your grain, of your harvest, and the firstborns of your cattle and your sheep, so that you shall learn to fear Yahweh your God all of the days. Okay, bring your tithes of all of your produce and all of your firstborn animals, bring them up to the temple, the place where God chooses to rest his name, and eat them yourself before God, so that you shall learn to fear God and recognize that everything that you have comes from him. However, this tithe, this tenth, is actually for your own enjoyment. And it even continues, if the way is too far away for you, and you cannot carry all of this produce, then you shall put the value of all of this produce and all of these animals into money, and you shall bundle the money in your hand, and you shall go to the place where God has chosen. And you shall give over the money for whatever your soul desires, be it cattle, sheep, wine, beer, and whatever your soul asks. And you shall eat there before Yahweh your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. Okay, so rejoice with your own blessings. And it concludes, give the Levite as well, because he does not have an inheritance with you. So that's just freely sharing with the Levite and with anyone who you'd like. But you are supposed to enjoy the works of your own hands. You're supposed to enjoy the blessings that God gave you. A tenth of your own crops belongs to you. It just needs to be eaten up at the temple. Now again, truthfully, this does not apply nowadays. We do not have a temple, unfortunately, yet. Maybe if we would build it, then we would have it. But we don't. And so this, frankly, doesn't really apply. And even if symbolically you wanted to practice this tithe, it would be a celebration of your own harvest, of your own blessings under God in acknowledgement for what He's given you. So just see how manipulative that is. Taking a concept of tithes that is supposed to be enjoyed by you and saying that it has to go to them. Now here is the final tithe. And it is the tithe that goes to the poor people and to those who are in need. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 28. At the end of 3 years, you shall take out all of the tithes of your grain in that year, and you shall leave it in your gates, and the Levite shall come, for he has no portion and inheritance with you, and the sojourner, and the widow, and the orphan that are in your gates, and they shall eat, and they shall be satisfied, so that Yahweh your God shall bless you in all the works of your hands, which you shall do. At the end of 3 years, because every year you're taking the tithes to the temple to eat it for yourself, but at the end of 3 years, you then take those tithes out and you bring them to the poor. You bring them to the Levite who doesn't have an inheritance. You give it to the sojourner who just lives among you, but he doesn't have the same support system that a native will have. You give it to the orphan. You give it to the widow, women and children that do not have men to provide for them. You give it to those in need. You give it to individual people who need this food, who need this extra support. And so again, completely independent of the systems. You're giving it to those who need it, truly need it, not just to some overlord institution. When you read the Torah, you will see just how serious God is about caring for the poor, and that all of the programs that are in place are not government-imposed systems that are there to care for the poor. This is not something that the government can tell you how to regulate your money for programs for the poor. No, it is an obligation on each and every individual to leave the corner of their field for the poor, to leave their extra bundles that they left and forgot in the field. Leave them for the poor. Leave your extra grapes and your extra olives. Every 7 years, there's actually a Sabbath of the land where people have to just leave their fields be and everything is for the taking. The vision that God has for His people is one of justice and righteousness and kindness, where you can't even charge interest to your brother, where you should give him loans and every 7 years those loans are forgiven. These are powerful laws of charity and laws that will ensure that as a people we will all be provided for, and that no one will be left behind, and that no one will be left starving and without any support net to catch them, even in their times of need, even when they're destitute and impoverished. God encourages us to be merciful. He tells us to bring that out of ourselves, to recognize that the fact that we're blessed should just make us fear God more, to recognize that everything that we have is from Him, and in any moment we can lose it. And so let's be thankful to Him. Let's rejoice with the blessings that He's given us, and let's give our tithes, our 10% that we have. And by the way, the obligation is at the end of 3 years, so it's not even every year. But every 3 years, you give your tithes to those who are less fortunate than you. You help out the needy, you help out the poor, you help out the destitute, you help out those who are helpless. So enough with the governments and the religious institutions trying to get their money-grubbing hands into your pockets, telling you that they know how to best distribute your money and your earnings that God gave you. That's not correct. That's not how things should actually go. The way things should go is that God blesses you, and you take those blessings because God tells you to share, and God tells you to be righteous, and God tells you to be charitable. You go ahead and you give that out to the people that you know need that help, and give them amounts that will help them get on their own 2 feet and actually encourage a healthy society where people are growing and supporting each other and helping one another, so that we can all become self-sufficient and we can all become well off enough to live blessed lives where everyone has plenty and goodness for all eternity.